The alarm cut through the quiet morning like a blade through silk. Every guard at Ashworth Palace froze for half a second, then moved at once. Boots on stone, radios crackling. A breach had been detected near the eastern wall, the one that faced the old orchard where tourists were never allowed. Edward Calloway was already moving before the second alarm tone finished. He did not run. He walked with the kind of speed that looked calm from a distance and urgent up close, the rifle slung across his back the way it had been slung for 30 years, since before most of the other guards were born. Daniel Voss reached the eastern wall first, his tactical vest still half-buckled, his modern rifle raised and ready, its red dot scope blinking to life. Behind him came 4 younger guards, all with the same gear, all moving with the same nervous energy of people who had trained for this moment, but never lived it. Edward arrived last. Nobody noticed at first. They were all staring at the orchard gate, at the shadow that had triggered the sensor. The shadow turned out to be a fox. It slipped under the gate and vanished into the hedges, unaware that it had just caused a small storm inside the palace grounds. The guards lowered their weapons one by one, breathing out the tension that had gathered in their shoulders. Daniel laughed first, the kind of laugh that comes from relief but quickly turns into something else. He turned around, scanning the guards behind him, and his eyes landed on Edward. "You're still carrying that old thing?" Daniel asked, nodding at the rifle across Edward's back. "I thought maybe you'd retire it along with yourself one day." A few of the younger guards chuckled, not because it was especially funny, but because Daniel was their captain, and laughing along was easier than staying silent. Edward said nothing. He adjusted the strap on his shoulder and looked toward the orchard gate, making sure the latch was secure, before turning back toward the main building. "I mean it," Daniel continued, following him. "That rifle looks like it belongs behind glass in a museum, not on a man's back. We have real equipment now, sights that see in the dark, triggers that don't need a prayer before they fire straight." "It still fires straight," Edward said quietly, the first words he had spoken since the alarm went off. Daniel raised an eyebrow, clearly enjoying himself. "Prove it, old man. When was the last time you even used it? Cleaning it in your quarters at night doesn't count." Edward kept walking. He did not answer the question, and his silence seemed to bother Daniel more than any argument could have. By the time they reached the guardhouse, the morning had settled back into its usual rhythm. Staff moved across the courtyard carrying trays and folders. A gardener trimmed hedges near the fountain. The palace, home to the Ashworth family for 4 generations, carried on as if the alarm had never sounded. Inside the guardhouse, Edward hung his coat on the same hook he always used, third from the door, and sat down at the small wooden table near the window. He unwrapped a cloth bundle he kept in a drawer and began to clean his rifle, the same routine he followed every single day at this hour, rain or shine, quiet mornings or chaotic ones. Charlotte Bryce, one of the younger palace aides, stepped into the guardhouse to drop off the morning schedule. She paused at the doorway, watching Edward work. His hands moved with a kind of patience that seemed almost out of place in a world of blinking screens and tactical vests. "Everyone's talking about the fox," she said, smiling. "Foxes have a habit of doing that," Edward replied without looking up, "making grown men jump." She laughed, and for a moment, the guardhouse felt warmer than it had all morning. She noticed the rifle in his hands, the dark wood of the stock worn smooth in places from years of handling, the metal barrel polished despite its age. "Can I ask you something?" she said. Edward glanced up. "Why do you still carry that?" "The palace bought new rifles for everyone 2 years ago. You could have one just like Daniel's." Edward set the cloth down and looked at the rifle resting across his knees. For a moment his eyes seemed to travel somewhere far away, somewhere outside the guardhouse walls entirely. "Some things aren't about what's new," he said finally. "They're about what's proven." Charlotte wanted to ask more, but the radio on her belt crackled with a message from the main office, and she excused herself with a small wave before hurrying off toward the palace's east wing. Edward returned to his cleaning, unaware that outside the guardhouse window, Daniel stood watching him through the glass, arms crossed, a look on his face that was not quite anger and not quite amusement, but something caught between the two. The rest of the day passed the way most days passed at Ashworth Palace. Visitors came and went through the public gardens. Staff moved quietly through their duties. The guards rotated through their shifts, watching gates, checking badges, walking the perimeter in slow, steady loops. But something had shifted that morning, something small but noticeable, like a stone dropped into still water. Daniel's comment about the rifle had planted itself in the minds of the younger guards, and by the time evening arrived, it had grown into something bigger than a passing joke. At dinner in the staff hall, two of the younger guards sat near Edward's usual table, speaking just loud enough for him to hear. "I heard he won't even let anyone touch it," one said. "Maybe it's cursed," the other joked. "Maybe that's why he keeps it a secret." Edward ate his meal in silence, the same quiet composure he carried through every conversation that touched on the subject. He had heard worse than jokes over the years. Words meant little to a man who measured his worth in something steadier than opinion. When the hall emptied and the lights dimmed for the night, Edward walked the long path back to his quarters near the guardhouse, the rifle slung over his shoulder as always. The palace grounds were quiet at this hour, the fountains switched off, the hedges dark shapes against a deepening sky. He stopped near the old stone wall that bordered the orchard, the same wall the fox had slipped beneath that morning. He looked out over the trees for a long moment, his breath visible in the cooling air. Somewhere behind him, footsteps approached. He recognized the rhythm before he turned around. "You're out late," Daniel said, stepping up beside him, his tone lighter now than it had been that morning, though something guarded still lingered beneath it. "Habit," Edward replied. Daniel studied him for a moment, then glanced at the rifle. "I wasn't trying to insult you this morning. I just don't understand why you'd choose to carry something so far behind the times when better tools exist." "Better for what?" Edward asked. "For accuracy, for speed, for everything a modern guard needs." Edward turned to face him fully for the first time since the conversation began. "A tool is only as good as the person carrying it, Daniel. New doesn't always mean better. Sometimes it just means unfamiliar." Daniel opened his mouth to respond, but the words seemed to catch somewhere before they reached his lips. Instead, he simply nodded once, a small, uncertain gesture, and turned to walk back toward the main building. Edward remained by the wall a while longer, watching the last light fade behind the orchard trees, the rifle resting quietly against his shoulder, carrying the weight of a story none of them yet understood. The next morning brought a different kind of announcement, one that would soon turn quiet mornings and passing jokes into something far more serious than anyone at Ashworth Palace expected. The Ashworth family had hosted their anniversary celebration every year for as long as anyone at the palace could remember, but this year marked something bigger. It would be the 200th anniversary of the palace itself, and the family had invited guests from across the country, along with several visiting dignitaries whose security teams would arrive days in advance to review every detail of the grounds. Word of the celebration spread through the staff quarters within hours. Extra guards would be brought in, new protocols would be tested, and most importantly, according to the memo pinned to the guardhouse board, there would be a demonstration event planned for the visiting security teams, a chance for Ashworth Palace to show off its readiness and skill. Daniel read the memo twice, his mind already working through the possibilities. A demonstration meant an audience meant attention, and attention was something Daniel had wanted since the day he arrived at the palace 3 years earlier, hoping to prove that a young captain could run a security team as well as any veteran twice his age. He found Edward near the eastern wall later that day, checking the same latch he checked every morning without fail. "Have you seen the memo?" Daniel asked. Edward nodded. "A demonstration. That should be interesting." "It's more than interesting. It's an opportunity." Daniel leaned against the wall, watching Edward work. "Visiting security teams from 3 different estates will be here. This is our chance to show them what real skill looks like." "And what does real skill look like to you?" Daniel smiled, though it did not quite reach his eyes. Precision, speed, modern equipment used the way it's meant to be used. Edward finished checking the latch and straightened up, meeting Daniel's gaze evenly. Skill isn't about the equipment, Daniel. It never has been. Then prove it, Daniel said, his voice carrying an edge that had not been there in their previous conversations. Take part in the demonstration. Use that old rifle of yours in front of everyone. Let's see if your philosophy holds up when people are actually watching. For the first time since the conversation began, Edward hesitated, not out of fear, but out of the quiet understanding that some challenges, once accepted, could not be taken back. "I'll think about it," he said finally, and walked away before Daniel could press him further. That evening, word of the exchange had already made its way through the staff quarters, growing larger and more dramatic with each retelling. By the time Charlotte heard about it during dinner, the story had transformed into something closer to a duel than a simple disagreement between two guards. She found Edward later that night in the guardhouse, cleaning his rifle as always, the routine unchanged despite everything swirling around him. "Is it true?" she asked. "Daniel wants you to compete against him at the demonstration." "Something like that," Edward said. "Are you going to do it?" Edward paused, running the cloth along the barrel one final time before setting it down. "I haven't decided yet." Charlotte sat down across from him, studying his face in the dim light of the guardhouse lamp. "Why not? You clearly know how to use that thing. I've seen the way you check it every day, the way you care for it. That's not the behavior of someone who doubts himself." "It's not about doubt," Edward said. "It's about what happens after. If I say yes and it goes well, nothing changes. If I say yes and it goes badly, everything changes. My place here, my reputation, everything I've built over the years could shift because of one afternoon in front of strangers. And if you say no?" Edward looked at her for a long moment. "Then Daniel gets exactly what he wants without ever having to prove anything himself." Charlotte considered this, then asked the question that had been sitting at the back of her mind since the moment she first saw the rifle in his hands. "Where did you learn to use it? Really learn, I mean. Not just enough to clean it every morning." Edward's expression softened, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly, as his mind drifted somewhere far from the guardhouse walls. "My father gave me this rifle when I was 17, he said. "He served for many years before me, in places I won't go into detail about tonight. When he came home, he brought two things with him, this rifle and a set of lessons he taught me every weekend for 3 years straight." "What kind of lessons?" "Patience mostly, breathing, understanding that the target doesn't move until you let your mind settle first. He used to say that a rushed shot was worse than no shot at all, because a rushed shot could convince you that skill was the same thing as luck." Charlotte listened quietly, aware that she was hearing something Edward rarely shared with anyone. "After he passed, I kept the rifle," Edward continued. "Not because I needed a weapon. I could have carried anything the palace offered me over the years. I kept it because every time I clean it, every time I check it, I remember exactly what he taught me. That kind of memory doesn't come from a red dot scope or a digital display. It comes from something older than that." Charlotte sat in silence for a moment, letting his words settle. "Then take the challenge," she said finally. "Not for Daniel, not even for yourself. Do it because that story deserves to be seen by more than just this guardhouse." Edward considered her words carefully, the same patience his father had taught him decades earlier, guiding his thoughts now. "I'll need to practice," he said quietly. "It's been a while since I've fired anything beyond routine checks." "Then practice," Charlotte said, smiling. "You have time before the celebration." Over the following days, Edward began returning to the old range behind the palace's northern field, a space rarely used since the newer guards preferred the indoor simulation systems installed 2 years earlier. The range was quiet, overgrown at the edges, but the targets still stood exactly where they had been placed years ago. He arrived early each morning before his shift began, setting up targets at various distances, adjusting for wind, for light, for every small detail his father had once drilled into him during those long weekend lessons. Each shot brought back a memory. Each recoil against his shoulder reminded him of afternoons spent standing beside his father in a field much like this one, learning patience before he ever learned precision. Word of his practice sessions eventually reached Daniel, who watched from a distance one morning, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He said nothing, but the look on his face suggested that Edward's silence had been mistaken for hesitation, and that mistake was about to be corrected. The days passed quickly after that, each one bringing the palace closer to its anniversary celebration, and closer to the demonstration that would decide far more than either Edward or Daniel initially realized. The morning of the celebration arrived with clear skies and a soft breeze moving through the palace gardens, the kind of weather that made even routine tasks feel lighter than usual. Staff moved briskly across the courtyard, carrying flowers, arranging chairs, testing the sound system that would carry announcements across the grounds later that afternoon. Edward arrived at the guardhouse earlier than his usual hour, the rifle cleaned and ready, resting against the wall near his coat. He sat quietly at the wooden table, hands folded in front of him, watching the courtyard fill with activity through the window. Charlotte found him there an hour before the demonstration was scheduled to begin. She carried 2 cups of tea, setting one down in front of him before taking the seat across the table. "Nervous?" she asked. "Focused," Edward corrected gently. She smiled, though her eyes carried a flicker of concern she tried to hide. The visiting teams arrived early this morning, 3 estates, just like the memo said. Their guards have been walking the grounds since sunrise, checking every corner. "That's their job," Edward said. "Daniel's been walking around like he already won something," Charlotte added, unable to keep the edge out of her voice. "He's been showing off his new scope to anyone who'll listen." Edward allowed himself a small, quiet smile. Let him enjoy the morning. Afternoons have a way of surprising people. By midday, the palace courtyard had transformed into something resembling a small festival. Guests filled the rows of white chairs set up near the eastern lawn, dignitaries and estate owners mixing with palace staff and members of the Ashworth family. Children ran between the hedges, while musicians played softly near the fountain, filling the air with a light, celebratory rhythm. The Ashworth family patriarch, an elderly man named Leonard Ashworth, stood near the podium reviewing his notes for the afternoon speech, occasionally glancing toward the range set up at the far end of the lawn, where targets had been arranged for the security demonstration promised in the earlier announcements. Daniel arrived at the range an hour before the event, dressed in a crisp uniform, his modern rifle slung confidently over his shoulder, its polished surface catching the afternoon light. Several guards from the visiting estates gathered near him, admiring the weapon's sleek design, asking questions about its range and accuracy. "This is what real security looks like," Daniel said, loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear. "Precision engineering, digital calibration, no guesswork involved." One of the visiting guards, a tall woman named Isabel Marsh from a neighboring estate, nodded appreciatively. "Impressive equipment, though I heard there's another guard taking part today. Someone with a different approach entirely." Daniel's expression flickered, just slightly. "You mean Edward?" "Yes, he'll be joining the demonstration." "With what kind of rifle?" Isabel asked. "Something older," Daniel said, choosing his words carefully. "A family piece, from what I understand." Isabel raised an eyebrow, curious rather than dismissive. "That should be interesting to watch." As the afternoon sun climbed higher, the crowd began settling into their seats, murmurs of conversation blending with the distant sound of birds calling from the orchard trees. Leonard Ashworth approached the podium, tapping the microphone gently before beginning his welcome speech, thanking guests for joining the celebration of 2 centuries of history tied to the palace grounds. After a few minutes of gracious remarks, he gestured toward the range set up nearby. "As part of today's celebration, our security teams have prepared a demonstration to showcase the skill and readiness that protects this palace and its grounds every single day. I invite you all to watch closely." The crowd applauded politely, shifting their attention toward the range, where 5 targets stood at varying distances, each marked with a small red center barely visible from where the guest sat. Daniel stepped forward first, raising his rifle with practiced confidence, the crowd murmuring appreciation at the weapon's sleek design. He aimed carefully, adjusting his stance, and fired at the first target. A clean hit near the center brought a round of applause from the crowd. He moved to the second target, then the third, each shot landing close to the mark, though not quite as precise as the first. By the time he reached the fifth and final target, sweat had begun to form along his brow, the pressure of the audience clearly weighing on his usual composure. His final shot landed just outside the center, close, but not perfect. Still, the crowd applauded warmly, impressed by his overall performance. Daniel lowered his rifle, allowing himself a small, satisfied smile as he stepped back from the range. Leonard Ashworth turned toward the crowd once more. And now, our next demonstration comes from one of our longest-serving guards, a man who has protected these grounds for over 3 decades. Edward stepped forward, the old rifle resting easily against his shoulder, his expression calm despite the hundreds of eyes now turning toward him. Whispers spread through the crowd, some curious, some clearly amused at the sight of such an old weapon standing in contrast to the sleek equipment Daniel had just used. Isabel Marsh leaned toward the guard standing beside her. "That's the rifle Daniel mentioned?" "Apparently so," the guard replied, unable to hide a small chuckle. Daniel stood near the edge of the range, arms crossed, watching Edward step up to the firing line with an expression caught somewhere between curiosity and quiet satisfaction, as though the outcome had already been decided in his mind. Edward set his stance, the same stance his father had taught him decades earlier, in a field far from any palace or audience. He breathed slowly, allowing the noise of the crowd to fade into the background, the way he had trained himself to do since he was 17 years old. The first target waited 50 yards ahead, its small red center barely visible even to those sitting close to the range. Edward raised the rifle, steadied his breathing, and fired. The shot landed dead center, drawing a surprised murmur from the crowd. He moved to the second target without pause, firing again, another clean hit, landing precisely in the middle. The murmurs grew louder, curiosity replacing the earlier amusement. By the third shot, the crowd had grown noticeably quiet, watching with a kind of focused attention that had not been present during Daniel's turn. Edward moved steadily from target to target, each shot landing with the same quiet precision, the same unshaken calm guiding every motion. Daniel's arms slowly uncrossed as he watched, his earlier confidence fading with each passing shot. Beside him, Isabel Marsh leaned forward slightly, her earlier curiosity now sharpening into genuine attention. Edward reached the fourth target, fired, another clean hit. The crowd had gone almost completely silent now, save for the occasional whisper of disbelief passing between guests. Charlotte, standing near the edge of the seating area, watched with her hands clasped tightly together, unable to hide the small, proud smile forming at the corner of her mouth. Only one target remained, the fifth and final mark standing at the farthest distance of the range, nearly 70 yards away, its red center almost invisible against the afternoon light. Edward lowered the rifle slightly, taking a moment longer than he had with the previous shots, allowing his breathing to settle completely. The crowd waited, the earlier festival atmosphere replaced entirely by a tense, focused silence that seemed to stretch the seconds longer than they should have lasted. Leonard Ashworth watched from the podium, his earlier polite smile now replaced by genuine curiosity. Edward raised the rifle one final time. The final shot cracked through the quiet afternoon air, sharp and clean, cutting through the tension that had settled over the crowd like a held breath, finally released. For a moment, nobody moved, nobody spoke. Every eye remained fixed on the fifth target, waiting for confirmation of what many in the crowd already suspected but had not yet allowed themselves to believe. A staff member positioned near the targets lifted a small flag, the signal used to confirm a hit at the center mark. The flag rose high, waving clearly for the entire crowd to see. Dead center, every single shot, from the first target to the last, had landed exactly where Edward intended. The silence broke into applause that rose steadily, growing louder with each passing second until it filled the entire courtyard, guests rising from their seats, hands clapping enthusiastically, voices calling out in genuine amazement. Leonard Ashworth stepped forward from the podium, clapping along with the rest of the crowd, a wide smile spreading across his face. Edward lowered the rifle slowly, resting it against his shoulder, the way he always did, his expression calm despite the roaring applause surrounding him. He did not smile widely or raise his arms in celebration. He simply stood there, the same quiet composure he carried every single day, as though the demonstration had been nothing more than another ordinary shift at the palace gates. Isabel Marsh turned toward Daniel, her earlier curiosity now replaced with clear admiration directed entirely at Edward. "That's not luck," she said. "That's decades of discipline." Daniel said nothing at first, his eyes fixed on Edward, his earlier confidence replaced by something closer to quiet disbelief. The applause continued around him, guests rising from their seats to get a better look at the old guard, who had just outperformed every modern piece of equipment on display that afternoon. Charlotte pushed through the crowd, reaching Edward just as the applause began to settle into excited conversation among the guests. "You did it," she said, her voice carrying genuine happiness rather than surprise. "Every single shot." "My father taught me well," Edward replied simply, though the warmth in his eyes betrayed the pride he rarely allowed himself to show. Leonard Ashworth approached next, extending his hand toward Edward with genuine respect. 30 years of service, and I never once witnessed anything like what I just saw today. That rifle of yours carries more history than half the artifacts inside this palace." "It carries lessons, sir," Edward said, shaking his hand. "The rifle is just the reminder." The crowd slowly began to disperse from the range, guests moving toward the refreshment tables set up near the fountain, still discussing the demonstration with animated excitement. Several of the visiting security teams approached Edward directly, asking questions about his technique, his training, the history behind the rifle that had captured everyone's attention. Daniel remained near the edge of the range, watching the crowd surround Edward with genuine curiosity and respect, the very opposite of the mockery he had directed toward the old rifle just days earlier. He felt something shift inside him, an uncomfortable realization settling in his chest as he watched the scene unfold. He waited until most of the crowd had moved on before approaching Edward, who was in the middle of answering a question from one of the younger palace guards about wind calculation at long distances. "Edward," Daniel said, his voice quieter than it had been in any of their previous conversations. Edward turned toward him, his expression neutral, waiting. "I was wrong," Daniel said, the words clearly costing him more effort than any of his earlier confident remarks. "About the rifle. About everything I said this past week. I let the equipment convince me that skill was something you could buy instead of earn." Edward studied him for a moment, then nodded slowly. "It's an easy mistake, especially in a world that keeps insisting new is always better." "I still don't fully understand how you did it," Daniel admitted. "Every single shot, no hesitation, no adjustment for the equipment's age or condition." "The equipment isn't old," Edward said. "It's proven. There's a difference. Every mark on this rifle represents a lesson learned, a mistake corrected, a moment where patience mattered more than speed. That's not something you can find in a manual or a digital display." Daniel absorbed this quietly, his earlier arrogance replaced by something closer to genuine curiosity. "Would you be willing to teach some of it? Not the exact techniques, necessarily, but the philosophy behind it, the patience, the discipline you mentioned to Charlotte." Edward raised an eyebrow slightly, surprised by the request, but not entirely unwilling to consider it. "That depends on whether you're ready to unlearn a few things first." "I think today proved I might be," Daniel said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through his earlier discomfort. As the afternoon light began to soften into early evening, The celebration continued across the palace grounds, musicians resuming their earlier performance, guests mingling near the gardens, the demonstration slowly becoming one of many stories exchanged throughout the event. But among the staff and visiting security teams, one particular story continued circulating with far more energy than any other moment from that day. Isabel Marsh found Charlotte near the refreshment table later that evening, still smiling from the afternoon's events. "Your friend certainly gave everyone something to talk about," she said. "He's been giving people something to talk about for 30 years, Charlotte replied. "Most people just weren't paying close enough attention until today." As evening settled over Ashworth Palace, the guardhouse eventually emptied of its usual visitors, the celebration winding down into quiet conversations and distant laughter carried on the cooling breeze. Edward walked his familiar path back toward his quarters, the rifle resting against his shoulder exactly as it always had, though something about the walk felt different tonight. Younger guards who passed him along the way offered small nods of respect that had not existed the week before. Daniel, walking a short distance behind him, matched his pace rather than rushing ahead the way he usually did, choosing instead to walk beside him in quiet, thoughtful silence. Near the same stone wall where their earlier conversation had taken place, Edward paused, looking out over the darkening orchard one final time before heading inside for the night. "Same time tomorrow?" Daniel asked, gesturing vaguely toward the northern range. Edward considered the question for a moment, then nodded. "Bring your rifle. We'll start with breathing." Daniel smiled, genuinely this time, before continuing on toward the main building, leaving Edward alone by the wall for a few final quiet minutes. He looked down at the rifle in his hands, running his thumb once along the worn wood of the stock, feeling the weight of decades settled quietly within it. Somewhere beyond the orchard trees, the last of the celebration's lights flickered across the palace lawn, the applause and excitement of the afternoon already fading into memory. But for Edward, none of that mattered nearly as much as what remained constant through every single day he had spent at these gates. Not the applause, not the recognition, just the rifle in his hands, the lessons behind it, and the quiet understanding that some things earn their place not through newness, but through time, patience, and the steady hands of someone who never stopped believing in what he carried. He turned and walked the rest of the way to his quarters, the orchard settling into darkness behind him, the palace grounds finally quiet after a day that had changed far more than anyone standing on that range that afternoon had expected.